Friends, this is it. This is part 6 and the final episode within the series we've been looking at, the parable of the lost son. But as we found out in the last episode, it's really the parable of the lost sons. And I'm reminded of a story of when I lived in Jerusalem. I had the chance to study under a great rabbi, and this man's entire life was on classical rabbinic literature, where there's more than 4,000 parables from around the time of Jesus, and his life has been looking in on that literature and all of the rabbis. And one of the things that he said was, the other rabbis could not hold a candle to the parables that Jesus told. And by the way, he wasn't a messianic Jew. He didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. But when he looked at the parables of Jesus, he said they are layered, they are sophisticated. He said they're absolutely astounding. And this has been a series as we've been looking at Jesus and his explosive parables, and we've looked at a series of different parables, and particularly these in Luke 15. We see just how depth and nuanced and amazing these parables are that Jesus tells. And so in this last episode, I want to look at one final facet that is in this Luke 15 story that Jesus tells, this parable of the lost sons. And it's very timely for us for where we are at in the calendar. We are in the season of Lent. We are moving through this season where we have the cross on the forefront of our mind. We are moving towards Resurrection Sunday, and we are contemplating the cross and the implications of Jesus' life, but also his death and what it meant for him to conquer sin and death and to rise again, and what that means for us in our lives. This is a season where we camp on that. And so what I want to do is I want to look back in at the story that we have spent a number of episodes understanding and digging into. And I want to talk about this in light of honor and shame. Now, this is something that is hard for people who live like me in the Western world to get our minds around. But in the ancient world, and even in the Middle East today, honor and shame drive the behavior and the identity of the people. Everything that you do either brings honor or shame to you, to your family, and to your community. It's very communal oriented. Now, when we hear the word honor, this isn't a word that I think we really understand well in our Western world anymore. I think we've lost the sense of what honor means. We're very individualistic. It's very much about what I can do, what I can achieve. And oftentimes we do that without much regard for other people. Now, I know that's a bit of a blanket statement, but I think you understand what I'm getting at. Shame is a word that we hear more often, but the difference is that when we talk about shame, particularly in our Western world today, this is an internal feeling that someone has. When someone says, well, I feel shame, it is typically something that was either done to them that has made them feel a certain way on the inside, or it's something that they have done. And so it is this internal manifestation of something that has happened, or something that they have done, or something sadly that may have been done to them. And we talk about shame in that way. But shame in the Middle Eastern context, shame in the ancient world, isn't an internal reality as much as it's something that is an external thing that the larger community would put upon you. Meaning, if you did something that was shameful, that was like a stain that you would get that would be hard to get rid of. So think about shame in this way, that shame was like a stain you couldn't easily get rid of. So if you did something that was wrong or that was just awful and it brought shame to you and your family and your community, it was like the community as a whole would put shame on you, and it wasn't something that you could easily get rid of. And so every decision that you made in the ancient world would either bring a sense of honor to you and your family and your community, or it would bring a sense of shame. And nobody wanted shame. Shame was a stain. And you can see even today, in the Middle East, where from time to time you'll hear about honor killings, this is precisely because shame was brought to the family, and in order to reinstate honor, something would have to be done in order to eliminate that shame. Now, why are we talking about this in the midst of Luke 15? Well, honor and shame play such a central role in the Bible that it's almost never mentioned because everybody knew it was there. But for us in our 21st century Western world, we have to be given lenses in order to see how this is playing out throughout the biblical story, and particularly here in Luke 15. And so there is this undercurrent, this theme that is running through Luke 15 that I just want to highlight. We've done this in bits and pieces, but I want you to hear it all together. So notice again Jesus' story, Luke 15, 11 to 12. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." The younger son asks for his inheritance while his father is still alive, and thus saying to the father, "I wish you were dead." Friends, this brought shame upon the father. The older brother doesn't speak out against this. He doesn't step in as the role of the reconciler. This brings shame to the father. The father not only doesn't discipline his son, he actually divides his property between both of his sons, and in the eyes of the larger community, shame on the father for doing this. And in doing so, because the younger brother has shamed the father, the fact the older brother doesn't step in and shames the father, this brings shame on the family, and because the family is connected to the community is experiencing shame in the midst of this as well. And then it says not long after that, the younger son got together all he had. He liquidated the inheritance, bringing more shame upon the family, more anger among the community, that somebody within their own community would allow the younger son to do this, i.e. the father. That was shame. Set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living, adding additional shame to the family because now he has squandered his inheritance. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. And as we know, he hired himself out to a citizen of that country, and now he's going to feed pigs. This is shameful to do when this is not a kosher context for a good Jew to be part of. They didn't give him anything. And then he came to his senses. How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death, right? He concocts a plan to go home. He says, I'm going to say to my father, I've sinned against heaven, right? I've sinned against God and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And as we've explored, he doesn't want to be a son. He wants to be able to come and go. He wants to earn his way back into his father's good graces. And so it says, so he got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The father, with compassion, ran. You don't run, dignified men. This is not something that you would readily see, and yet the father runs. And as he does so, he wraps his arms around him. He kisses him. And it's in the midst of his running. This is a communal setting. The moment the prodigal is walking home and crests the hill, all the little boys and girls in the village are out playing and the word is getting out. He is coming home. And it's like the anger of the community, the shame being levied upon the younger son is brought upon by the community. And it's the father who runs through the community and wraps his arms around him to shield his son from the shame of the community and to profoundly state to the larger community that he is forgiving his son. And to what extent does this forgiveness look like? The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet." He is reinstating him to sonhood. And then he says, "Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate." And because it's the fattened calf, this is for the whole community. This is a reconciling meal to do away with the shame, to try to reinstate honor, to say, "Listen, I know my boy has blown it, but I have forgiven him. Let's celebrate. Let's talk about grace and mercy and forgiveness and love." And it's this amazing moment in the midst of the scene. And as the father goes on, "For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began the party, right? They began to celebrate. But meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." And then the older brother became angry and refused to go in. The one who was to play the role of the reconciler, a role he abdicated at the beginning of the story, is now confronted with his younger brother coming home. And he shames his father and the family by refusing to go in. And not only that, his father went out. The father shames himself as the host of the party to leave the party to go to his son. And he doesn't just go and say, "Hey, get in here." He began to plead with him. It's like he's trying to make sense of this with his son. I mean, this is like shame upon shame for the father to do in this Oriental, this Middle Eastern context. And then the older brother said to his father, "Look," he doesn't even address him. He brings more shame upon the father. "All these years I've been slaving for you." Right? It's just like shame upon shame. "And I've never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours," he doesn't even want to identify that this is his brother. Right? He wants to completely disconnect. So he says to his father, in a sense, he goes, "This is your son. This problem is yours. Shame on you for the way that your son has behaved." Like he has totally taken away any of his own responsibility that he has to play in the story. "Who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home and you kill the fattened calf for him? My son," the father said, "you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours," this is about reconciliation. This is about us coming back together as a family, "was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Friends, this is a story saturated with shame. And this is something that Jesus' audience would have picked up in the midst of Jesus telling such a tension-laden story. But friends, what is this story all about? Well, we've been exploring that over these last several episodes, is that this is a story that depicts the length to which God is willing to go to demonstrate his love to lost and broken people who are desperately in need of forgiveness and reconciliation. And as we identified in the last episode, we were reminded of the context of Jesus telling the story of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost sons in succession was because he was sharing a meal with those who were on the outside, those who represented in this story the younger son. And we said that the religious people were reflected in the older son. And Jesus and God are reflected in the Father. And in this story, we see God the Father as the Father in the story, but I've been very intentional to include Jesus in this. And here's why. Is that one of the astounding things that Jesus did with his parables is that he did something that no other rabbi did in the ancient world. You see, whenever a rabbi told a parable, it was always to expound upon a biblical passage, a story from the Bible. But friends, Jesus didn't just tell parables to expound upon passages from the Bible. He actually told parables that were about his life, his mission, his identity, his movement. And I love how succinctly Bible Project put this in their most recent video on how to read the Bible. They did one on the parables of Jesus. It's episode 16. It's very succinctly, they said this: Jesus didn't use his parables to teach about abstract religious or moral ideals. He said they were about himself and his mission. His mission, which was to announce that the kingdom of God was arriving on earth as it is in heaven. That when Jesus told these stories, he wasn't just expounding upon something. He was saying, this is what I am about. This is what my mission is about. This is what my movement is all about. And remember, in the first episode in this series, we talked about Jesus didn't just tell the story. He lived the story. And so when you look in on the parable of the lost sons and you recognize that Jesus is telling this story not just to expound upon some morals or ideals or just about who God is, he is demonstrating in the story what he is going to live out in his life. And we see this, and this isn't a surprise, and I love how Hebrews 1:3 puts it. It says, he, Jesus, is the radiance of the glory of God in the exact imprint of his nature. And so, friends, what we see playing out here is that Jesus lived it out in his life and in his death. That he lived out this message. He lived out the essence of the stories he was telling, particularly this one in Luke 15, in his life and also in his death. And friends, as we are in this season, when we are contemplating the cross, one of the things that we need to understand is that when it came to a Roman cross, friends, this was the most shameful instrument in the ancient world to die on. The shame that was on the cross was worse than the pain that you experience being crucified on a cross. Friends, everybody knew that there is shame on the cross. And so Jesus went to a cross on our behalf, and everybody understood this was the most shameful instrument in the ancient world, that the shame was worse than the pain of being crucified. The question I have for us is, how did Jesus view the shame on the cross? And we actually get an astounding passage in Hebrews chapter 12. Coming on the heels of Hebrews 11, which is this amazing chapter, not about the greatness of humanity, but the greatness of God to use humanity, sometimes in collaboration and at times with humanity not operating the way God wanted, but God was able to use it in order to advance the story forward. And as we come into Hebrews 12, it's this amazing passage where we know it so well, but let's hear it again. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, this word scorning here is the word kataphroneo in Greek. And it is a word that means to despise, to scorn, to look down upon, to disregard. Friends, the implication here is that when Jesus went to the cross, he paid no regard to the shame on the cross. Everybody knew that there was shame on the cross. But when Jesus went to the cross, he looked on that shame and he said, "You have no power over me. You have no bearing on my story. I disregard you and the power that you think you have." Friends, Jesus obliterated that shame on the cross. And when he despised it and when he scorned it, he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, victorious, because shame held nothing on Jesus Christ. And so, friends, when we just step back and we look at Luke 15, and we think about shame and we say, that shame was like a stain we couldn't get rid of. Friends, sin was a stain we couldn't get rid of. But as Paul reflects on the power of the cross in 2 Corinthians 5:21, he said, "God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." Friends, we were stained in shame. We had sin all over us. And yet Jesus became sin for us, so that we could be made clean. And the shame that was on the cross had no power over Jesus Christ. And so as we conclude this series on the parable of the lost sons, as we recognize that Jesus not only told these stories, he lived these stories, that we are reminded in this season where we celebrate the cross, that God, as the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, will go to whatever length necessary to let us know that we are loved, that we are accepted, that we are pursued, that we are cherished, that we are celebrated, and that we are part of God's family. And that as we reflect on this, as we are reminded of this, may this story continue to change us so that we also embody this reality and that we live it out in the world today, putting God's love and grace and mercy and forgiveness on display for all of humanity. Friends, that is worth celebrating. Well, friends, there you go. There's our series on the parable of the lost sons. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for listening. May you have an amazing season as we are leading up to Resurrection Sunday. And may we walk out this text well in our lives.